Chapter 21 Jesus The rest of the afternoon and evening were a blur to Amon. He walked around in a daze, his feet moving, but only because they knew how to do that on their own. Tamar, too, was unusually quiet, lost in thought. Benjamin seemed least affected by the scribe's words. He said, "How can a high priest steal?" about 3 times, but then shrugged it off and got back to the business of enjoying his day. But Benjamin's question wasn't what haunted Amon. The thoughts that plagued him had to do the thoughts that plagued him had to do with a solution to the problem. How does one prove that the high priest is a thief and a liar? Even if Neri agreed to testify before a court, there is no court by which you can try a high priest. He is accountable to no one except God. There is no one whom you can prove there was no urgent matter of state, that Caiaphas had left Amon's father alone on purpose so he could later accuse him. No one to whom you can say that Caiaphas himself had stolen the money. This dilemma pestered Amon all night long. Just before dawn he gave up trying to sleep and stood at the short wall that encircled the roof. He looked out over the city in the moonlight and saw here and there a torch or lamp still burning behind a window. He could see the glow of bonfires reflecting off the inside of the city walls where the guards stood watch at each gate, and he could see the outline of the temple, black against the sky. And black inside as well, Amon thought. Black with sin, the sin of a high priest who lies and steals and kills. For Amon, the temple would never feel the same again. Amon awoke with a start, the sun glaring in his eyes. It took him a moment to realize he was on the roof of his house, and another moment to realize he had eventually fallen asleep. In the next moment he realized that it was Monday, and that his father would be crucified in 4 days. He groped his way down the ladder and then down the stairs, and found his mother working and his 2 brothers playing. He yawned a yawn big enough to swallow a camel, then asked, "Where is Tamar?" "Her father returned this morning, so she and Benjamin went with him," she said. "He wanted them to meet Jesus." Amon scoffed. "I think there are more important things to do." Tabitha looked at her son. "Bartholomew asked that you would join them when you woke up." "I do not have time to meet a prophet," Amon answered, "especially a false prophet." "It would be the polite thing to do," Tabitha reminded him. "It is a fair request." Amon sighed, knowing she was right. "Where will I find them?" he asked. "At the temple," Tabitha answered, and once again Amon sighed. But a short time later Amon was in the court of Gentiles in the middle of a mob of bodies. It was only 3 days until the Passover celebration, and Jerusalem was filling up with pilgrims from across the land. Some, he knew, came from as far away as Antioch to celebrate Passover. More people meant the Romans needed more soldiers to keep the peace, and that meant that just across the courtyard in the fortress of Antonia 1,000 Roman soldiers were waiting. They came from all over Palestine to support the regiment normally stationed at Antonia. It was for this very reason that Cornelius had come to Jerusalem from Caesarea. A few moments later Amon was distracted by shouting from the other end of the courtyard. He pushed his way through the crowd, too short to see over the adults around him, but following the sound of the shouting. As he drew closer he could make out the words, "Hosanna to the Son of David!" The voices of children were shouting. When at last he broke through the crowd, Amon saw that 2 of those voices belonged to Tamar and Benjamin. "Hosanna!" they shouted again, and Amon could see they were directing their praise to a man seated on a stool, surrounded by children. Then he saw that it was Jesus. Amon stared in curiosity. The man was just a man. He looked much like any other Jew, a bit taller perhaps, strong arms from the hard labor of a Jew, but gentle hands that stroked the hair of a small girl. He smiled easily, this man, and laughed at the smallest of jokes from one of the children. But for Amon it was none of this that struck him deaf and dumb, and made him stare in awe. For Amon it was the eyes, crystal clear, piercing, yet with a kindness that covered Amon like a cloak. And then, quite unexpectedly, Jesus slowly raised his eyes and stared straight into Amon's. Lightning flashed through every corner of Amon's body. He sucked in his breath and held it. It was as if he had known the man all his life, and in that one gaze found a trustworthy friendship. Their eyes locked for several seconds, and Amon saw the man's smile grow just a bit bigger, and saw him nod in acknowledgment with just a slight tip of his head. Suddenly, Amon felt a tugging at his sleeve. He broke off eye contact with the Jew and looked to see Benjamin at his side. "It was a miracle!" Benjamin was shouting. "What was a miracle?" Amon asked. "He healed them," Benjamin explained. "He healed all of them." Amon gave a patient sigh. "Who healed whom?" "Jesus!" Benjamin shouted, as if Amon were on the other side of the courtyard. "Jesus healed everyone that came to him. Blind people, sick people, crippled people. He healed them all." Amon gave a second sigh, feeling a bit sorry for his immature friend. "Benjamin, do you see all these people?" he asked, sweeping his arm across the crowd. Benjamin nodded. "Of course. Well, I see their legs and feet anyhow." "And who are they?" Amon asked. But instead of waiting, he answered the question himself. "They are strangers," he said, emphasizing the word. "They are people you do not know. Many of them probably travel from town to town with this Jesus, pretending to be healed each time. In this way," Amon concluded his lecture, "they trick people into following Jesus and giving him their money." "But I saw it," Benjamin pleaded, "with my own eyes." "Did you know any of the people he healed?" Amon asked. Benjamin thought for a moment, then slowly shook his head. "Then there is your proof," Amon answered. "If he were really the Messiah, he could heal the people you know, not just the ones you do not know." Benjamin's shoulders slumped as he hung his head. Amon felt badly at making his friend sad, but knew it was for his own good. Just then a line of tall men in robes pushed their way through the children and stood in front of Jesus. Herodians. These were the followers of the high priest and of Herod, the men who were plotting to kill Jesus and Amon's father. The line of men shoved the children aside and formed a half circle around Jesus. They stood with their arms crossed and stared, and Jesus stared back. For a long moment there was silence. Then one by one the men lost their smug looks on their faces and instead looked confused. They started glancing back and forth at each other as if they were unsure who was to speak. Finally, one particularly hairy Herodian stepped forward, his arms still crossed over his chest. The Herodian cleared his throat. "Teacher," he started, and the people hushed. "We know you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth." The man was speaking very loudly, and Amon figured he was trying to impress all the people in the courtyard. "You aren't swayed by men," the Herodian continued, "because you pay no attention to who they are." At this, the hairy man started to slowly circle Jesus, moving out of his sight behind him. Amon could see that the Herodian was trying to make Jesus nervous. "Tell us, then," the friend of the high priest continued, "what is your opinion? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" A gasp swept across the crowd, and, for a moment, the courtyard was filled with the murmurs of speculation. How would Jesus answer such a question? Had the Herodian found a question too difficult even for the Messiah to answer? Amon knew what was going on. The high priest had no doubt sent his band of troublemakers to trick Jesus. If Jesus said they should pay taxes, then he would be breaking the Jewish law forbidding the use of images as idols. If he said they should not, he would be breaking the law of the Romans, who thought that Caesar was a god. Either way, Jesus would lose. The crowd quieted down as Jesus lifted the small girl off his lap and set her to the ground. Slowly he stood, keeping his back to the spokesman of the Herodians, his eyes on the rest of the gang. Jesus shook his head slowly as if he couldn't understand these men. Finally he drew in a deep breath. "You hypocrites," he said, his whisper a marked contrast to the loud rantings of the Herodian. "Why are you trying to trap me?" He looked from one man to the next, waiting for an answer that did not come. Instead, one by one, the Herodians uncrossed their arms, wiped their sweaty palms on their tunics, and lowered their gazes to the ground. Now Jesus simply nodded as if he understood. "Show me the coin used for paying the tax," he said in a loud voice, holding out his hand palm up. One of the Herodians quickly fumbled for his money pouch and, scurrying forward, placed a denarius in Jesus' hand. Jesus held the coin between his thumb and first finger and lifted it high for all to see. "Whose portrait is on this coin?" he asked in a booming voice, "and whose inscription?" The Herodians looked back and forth at each other, the question so obvious they thought it was a trick. "It is Caesar's," several of them answered finally. Jesus stared at them once again as if they were naughty schoolboys caught talking during Torah lessons. In a voice that was full of exasperation, he said to them, "Then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." Every pair of Herodian eyes grew wide at this answer. Not knowing how to respond and not even fully understanding, the Herodians quietly turned and slipped back into the crowd. "Did you hear that?" Benjamin cheered to Amon. "Did you hear how he—" "Amon?" Amon ignored his friend. He was staring off into the sky as if he expected an angel to appear right then and there. A few moments later his eyes widened and he grinned. Grabbing Benjamin by the tunic, he shouted, "That's it!" "That's what?" Benjamin asked. Amon still didn't answer his friend and started shoving his way through the crowd, passing Tamar. Amon, wait!" Tamar cried. "Amon, what is it?" Benjamin yelled as he stumbled to keep up. Amon stopped and spun around to face his two friends. "I've just figured out how to save my father," he shouted. "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's." And then he disappeared into the crowd.